Charlotte had always been someone who relied on herself. Ever since she could remember, she had been fixing things: bikes, lawnmowers, and eventually cars. Her hands, always a little calloused, told the story of someone who didn't shy away from hard work. Growing up, the garage had been her sanctuary, a place where the noise of wrenches turning bolts drowned out the chaos of her mother Deborah's relentless criticism. While other kids were chasing fleeting passions, Charlotte was saving every penny she earned from her weekend shifts at the local diner to fund her real dream: buying and restoring her own car. And finally, at 26, that dream became a reality. After years of scrimping, sacrificing, and saying no to everything from vacations to new clothes, she had bought herself a rare, damaged Dodge Challenger in 1970 Classic. It wasn't just any car. To Charlotte, it was the embodiment of her independence. The restoration process had been grueling but rewarding. She'd spent countless late nights at the repair shop where she worked, piecing the car back together with a level of care and precision most people reserved for their most treasured possessions. Every dent she hammered out and every screw she tightened wasn't just about making the car roadworthy. It was about proving to herself and to the world that she could accomplish something extraordinary on her own. The day she finally drove it out of the shop, its deep cherry red paint gleaming in the sun, was the proudest moment of her life. She had done it. She had taken something broken and beaten down and made it whole again, just like she had done with herself over the years. But as much pride as Charlotte took in her work, she knew there was one person who would never understand the significance of what she had achieved: her mother. Deborah had always found a way to make Charlotte feel small. From the time she was a child, her mother had dismissed her interests as unimportant or childish. "Why don't you focus on something real?" Deborah would say whenever Charlotte brought home a new project. "No one's going to care how well you can fix a car. You're just wasting your time." That was Deborah's way, always pushing Charlotte towards some imagined version of success that had nothing to do with what Charlotte actually wanted. But Charlotte had stopped trying to earn her mother's approval a long time ago. She'd learned the hard way that nothing she did would ever be good enough. So when Deborah stood on the driveway the day Charlotte brought her Challenger home, arms crossed and eyes narrowing as she inspected the car like it was some kind of inconvenience, Charlotte wasn't surprised. "You spent all that money on this?" Deborah asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "I thought you'd at least be smart enough to get something practical." "It's not about practicality," Mom Charlotte replied, her tone firm but calm. "It's about passion. I worked hard for this." Deborah scoffed. "Passion doesn't pay the bills. And you're going to regret wasting all your savings on a car that'll probably break down in a year. But I suppose that's just like you, impulsive and stubborn." Charlotte didn't respond. She refused to let her mother's words ruin her moment. Instead, she ran her fingers along the smooth curve of the car's hood, a quiet smile on her face. This car was hers, and no amount of Deborah's negativity could take that away. But Deborah wasn't done. As Charlotte turned to walk inside, her mother called after her, "You'll see. One day you'll wish you'd listened to me." It was a threat disguised as advice, a sharp reminder that Deborah didn't just want to control Charlotte, she wanted her to fail, just so she could say, "I told you so." Charlotte shook her head as she entered the house, closing the door firmly behind her. She had spent enough of her life living under her mother's shadow, and she wasn't about to let Deborah's bitterness seep into this new chapter. For once, she felt like she was moving forward, like she had a future that didn't involve constantly looking over her shoulder. That evening, Charlotte sat in her living room, staring out the window at her car parked in the driveway. The streetlights reflected off its polished surface, and for the first time in a long time she felt a deep sense of contentment. She had earned this. She had built this. And nothing, certainly not her mother's disapproval, could change that. But Charlotte should have known better than to let her guard down. Growing up with Deborah had taught her that the moment you thought you were safe was the moment the rug would be pulled out from under you. And sure enough, the next morning, when Charlotte walked outside to head to work, the driveway was empty. At first, she thought she must be imagining it. She stood there for a moment, blinking in the early sunlight, as if the car might somehow materialize if she stared at the spot long enough. But it didn't. Her heart began to race as she glanced up and down the street, hoping she had parked it somewhere else and simply forgotten. But she hadn't. The car was gone. Her first thought was theft. She fumbled for her phone and was about to call the police when a text message lit up her screen. It was from her mother. "I took the car. You're not ready for something like that. Consider this a lesson." Charlotte stared at the message in disbelief, her hands trembling. A lesson? Her mother had stolen her car, a car she had worked years to afford and months to restore, as some twisted form of parental discipline. The rage that bubbled up inside her was unlike anything she had ever felt. This wasn't just a breach of trust, it was a deliberate act of sabotage. She immediately called Deborah, her fingers shaking as she dialed the number. It rang twice before her mother picked up, her tone infuriatingly casual. "Hello? Where is my car?" Charlotte demanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Good morning to you too," Charlotte, Deborah replied, as though they were discussing the weather. "Your car is safe. I'm just holding on to it until you come to your senses." "Come to my senses?" Charlotte nearly shouted. "You stole my car, Mom. That's not holding on to it that's a crime." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Deborah said dismissively. "It's not like I sold it or anything. Yet." Charlotte froze. Yet. The word hung in the air like a threat. She could feel her blood boiling, but she forced herself to stay calm. Losing her temper wouldn't help. "Mom, I'm giving you one chance to bring the car back. If you don't, I'm calling the police." Deborah laughed, the sound cold and humorless. "Call them, if you think they'll care about a family dispute. Go ahead, Charlotte. See how far that gets you." Charlotte clenched her jaw, her mind racing. She knew her mother well enough to understand that Deborah wasn't bluffing. If she had taken the car, she had a plan, and Charlotte doubted it was anything good. But one thing was certain: she wasn't going to let her mother get away with this. Not this time. Charlotte's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat as she stared at the text message from her mother. The car wasn't just missing, it had been taken by someone who was supposed to love her, someone who had no right to meddle in her life like this. Deborah's calm dismissal of her actions only fueled the fire burning in Charlotte's chest. It was as if her mother didn't even realize the gravity of what she'd done, or worse, she didn't care. For years, Charlotte had tried to navigate her mother's controlling tendencies, brushing off comments and criticisms to maintain some semblance of peace. But this was beyond anything she could have prepared for. Her prized possession, her sanctuary, the tangible result of years of hard work and sacrifice, had been snatched away without warning. Without wasting another second, Charlotte marched back into the house, her hands shaking as she grabbed her keys and wallet. She didn't even know where to start looking, but staying idle wasn't an option. She fired off another text to Deborah, her fingers stabbing at the screen with barely controlled rage. "Where is my car?" Now she hit send, then stared at the screen, waiting for the three dots to appear, signaling a reply. Nothing. Her mother had either turned off her phone or decided to ignore her entirely. Charlotte threw her phone onto the passenger seat of her old truck as she climbed in, her mind racing with possibilities. It wasn't just about the car, it was about control. Deborah had always found ways to undermine Charlotte's confidence, to remind her that she was still, in her mother's eyes, a child incapable of making her own decisions. This time, though, Deborah had taken things to a whole new level, and Charlotte wasn't about to let it slide. She didn't care if Deborah thought it was just a family matter. She was ready to escalate this as far as it needed to go. Charlotte's first instinct was to call the police, but she hesitated. Deborah was right about one thing: family disputes over property were often dismissed as personal issues. But this wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was theft. Charlotte decided she needed proof, something concrete to show that the car had been taken without her consent. She started by driving around the neighborhood, scanning side streets and driveways, hoping against hope that her mother hadn't gone far. The Challenger was a standout vehicle, its cherry red paint gleaming like a beacon even under the faint morning light. But as she turned corner after corner, there was no sign of it. Frustration clawed at her insides, but Charlotte forced herself to think rationally. If her mother had taken the car, she wouldn't have parked it somewhere obvious. Deborah wasn't careless. She was calculated, always 2 steps ahead in her twisted games of control. Charlotte pulled over at a gas station, opened her phone, and began scrolling through local traffic cameras. Over the years, she'd learned a few tricks from the shop where she worked, one of which was how to access certain public camera feeds. It wasn't exactly legal, but it wasn't outright hacking either. She scanned through footage from the streets near her house, her eyes darting over the blurry images of passing cars. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she saw it. The Challenger, unmistakable in its bold color, was speeding through an intersection several miles away. Charlotte's stomach tightened as she zoomed in on the timestamp. The footage was from just 20 minutes earlier. Her mother was heading out of town, likely toward the industrial area on the outskirts of the city. That was strange in itself. Deborah had no reason to go there. The area was run down, full of warehouses and sketchy businesses that operated on the fringes of legality. It wasn't the kind of place her mother would visit unless she had a very specific reason. Charlotte didn't have time to analyze Deborah's motivations. She gripped the wheel and headed in the direction of the car. As she drove, 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. What was her mother planning to do with the Challenger? Sell it? Hide it? Destroy it? Each possibility was worse than the last, and the thought of someone else getting their hands on her car made her stomach churn. This wasn't just about the monetary value, though that was significant. It was about the principle. The car represented everything Charlotte had worked for, everything she had built on her own terms. If she let Deborah take that away, it would be like admitting defeat, like proving her mother right. When she reached the industrial district, Charlotte slowed down, her eyes scanning the streets for any sign of the Challenger. The area was eerily quiet, with most of the warehouses seemingly abandoned. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she drove past rows of boarded-up windows and rusted fences. It wasn't the kind of place she wanted to be alone, but she didn't have much of a choice. She turned onto a narrow side street, her heart leaping into her throat as she spotted the Challenger parked haphazardly in front of a crumbling brick building. Charlotte parked her truck a safe distance away and approached the building on foot, her senses on high alert. She didn't know what or who she might find inside, but she was prepared for the worst. As she got closer, she noticed the car's hood was slightly dented, and her stomach sank. Had her mother already done something to damage it? She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. Anger wouldn't help her now. The sound of voices drifted through the open doorway of the building, and Charlotte froze. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized one of the voices immediately, her mother's. Deborah was inside, and she wasn't alone. Charlotte crept closer, careful to stay out of sight, and peered through a crack in the doorway. What she saw made her blood run cold. Her mother was standing next to a man in a grease-stained jumpsuit, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He was leaning over the Challenger, inspecting it with an appraising eye. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," the man was saying, his voice gruff. "I'll take it off your hands, but not for the price we discussed. That dent on the hood knocks it down a couple grand." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. Her mother was trying to sell the car. Deborah, who had spent years berating Charlotte for wasting money on her ridiculous hobbies, was now using the Challenger to make a quick buck. Charlotte's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted nothing more than to storm in and confront her mother, but she forced herself to hold back. If she interrupted now, the man might leave, and she'd lose her chance to gather evidence. Instead, Charlotte pulled out her phone and started recording, her hands trembling as she zoomed in on the scene. The man was still talking, gesturing toward the car as Deborah nodded along. Charlotte couldn't hear every word, but it was enough to understand what was happening. Her mother was negotiating the sale of the car right down to the last detail. It was all Charlotte could do to keep herself from screaming. After a few minutes, the man handed Deborah an envelope, and she handed him the keys. Charlotte's heart sank as she realized the transaction was complete. Her car, her dream, was now in the hands of a stranger. She watched in stunned silence as the man climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The sound was like a dagger to her chest, a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. But as the car rolled forward, Something unexpected happened. The engine sputtered, and then the car stalled. Charlotte blinked in surprise as the man climbed out, cursing under his breath. He popped the hood and started tinkering with the engine, his frustration evident. Deborah crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "I told you it was in perfect condition," she snapped. "This is on you." Charlotte saw her opportunity. With the car temporarily out of commission, she had a chance to intervene. Summoning all her courage, she stepped into the doorway, her voice ringing out loud and clear. "What the hell are you doing, Mom?" Both Deborah and the man turned to face her, their expressions ranging from shock to annoyance. Charlotte felt her anger bubble to the surface, but she held it back, her focus laser sharp. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Charlotte's voice echoed through the dilapidated building, breaking the tense silence that had settled after the man climbed out of her Challenger, cursing the stalled engine. Deborah's head whipped around first, her expression a mix of irritation and disbelief, as though Charlotte's very presence was an act of betrayal. The man, still holding a wrench in one hand, froze mid-step, his gaze flicking between the car and Charlotte, trying to size up the situation. Charlotte's pulse raced as she stepped further into the building, her boots crunching against the gritty concrete floor. She kept her focus on her mother, who looked entirely unrepentant. "What am I doing?" Deborah said finally, her tone as sharp as ever. "I'm teaching you a lesson, Charlotte. A lesson you clearly need." Charlotte clenched her jaw, fighting to keep her emotions in check. She had been prepared for resistance, but the sheer audacity of her mother's response ignited a fresh wave of anger. "A lesson," she repeated, her voice low and cold. "You stole my car, drove it here, and tried to sell it to this guy." She gestured sharply toward the man, who took a cautious step back. "And you call that a lesson?" Deborah rolled her eyes, as if Charlotte were being overly dramatic. "You're too attached to that thing. It's just a car, Charlotte. I did what I had to do because you obviously don't understand how to prioritize." Charlotte's stomach churned. The casual way Deborah dismissed her actions, as if they were completely justified, was infuriating. But Charlotte knew better than to let her mother's manipulative tactics distract her. She turned her attention to the man whose initial bravado was clearly wavering. "You," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Step away from the car. Now." The man hesitated, looking to Deborah for direction, but Charlotte took another step closer, her presence commanding. "I said step away," she repeated, her tone brooking no argument. She could see the gears turning in his head. He wasn't sure what kind of mess he'd gotten himself into, but he was smart enough to recognize that Charlotte wasn't someone to be trifled with. Slowly, he raised his hands in a placating gesture and backed away from the car. "Hey, I didn't know it was stolen," he said defensively, his eyes darting nervously between Charlotte and Deborah. "She told me it was hers." "Of course she did," Charlotte snapped, not bothering to hide her disdain. "Now get out of here before I call the police." The man didn't need to be told twice. He tossed the wrench onto the ground with a loud clang, muttering under his breath as he retreated toward the door. Deborah called after him, her voice tinged with desperation. "Wait, we're not done here." But the man was already gone, the sound of his hurried footsteps fading into the distance. The building fell silent once more, leaving Charlotte and her mother alone with the Challenger between them. The car, once a symbol of Charlotte's hard work and independence, now felt like a battlefield, a stark reminder of the lengths Deborah would go to assert her control. "You've crossed a line, Mom," Charlotte said, her voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "You don't get to decide what's best for me. You don't get to steal from me and then act like you're doing me a favor." Deborah sighed, as if Charlotte were being unreasonable. "I didn't steal anything. You're my daughter, Charlotte. What's yours is mine." Charlotte felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. The absurdity of her mother's logic was almost too much to bear. "That's not how it works," she shot back. "I worked for this car. I paid for it. I rebuilt it with my own hands. You have no right to it, and you never did." Deborah folded her arms across her chest, her expression hardening. "Maybe you did work for it, but that doesn't mean you're ready for the responsibility that comes with owning something like this. You're reckless, Charlotte. You think you're so independent, but you don't even see how childish you're being. Charlotte's hands curled into fists at her sides. Reckless, she repeated, her voice rising. I'm the one who spent years saving up for this car, who spent every spare hour fixing it up, who made sure it was insured and roadworthy. Meanwhile, you're the one who drove it out here without my permission, dented the hood, and tried to sell it to a stranger. Tell me again who's being reckless. Deborah's lips tightened into a thin line, but she didn't back down. I'm your mother, she said, as if that were the ultimate trump card. I know what's best for you, even if you don't want to admit it. Charlotte shook her head, disbelief etched into every line of her face. You don't know anything about me, she said quietly, the weight of her words sinking in. You spent my entire life trying to control me, trying to mold me into someone I'm not. But this time you've gone too far. Deborah opened her mouth to respond, but Charlotte held up a hand, cutting her off. I'm done arguing with you, she said firmly. You've crossed the line, and there's no coming back from this. I'm calling the police. For the first time, Deborah's confidence seemed to falter. Don't be ridiculous, she said quickly, her tone losing some of its sharpness. You don't want to involve the police. This is just a misunderstanding, Charlotte. We can work this out. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. A misunderstanding, she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You stole my car, tried to sell it, and now you want me to sweep it under the rug? No, Mom. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is theft, plain and simple. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers hovering over the screen as she prepared to dial. But before she could press the call button, Deborah lunged forward, her hand darting out to snatch the phone from Charlotte's grasp. Don't you dare, she hissed, her voice low and threatening. Charlotte staggered back, caught off guard by her mother's sudden aggression. Give it back, she demanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Deborah clutched the phone tightly, her knuckles white. I'm not going to let you ruin your life over something so stupid, she said, her tone desperate. You're overreacting, Charlotte. You'll regret this. Charlotte's patience finally snapped. The only thing I regret is letting you think you could keep treating me like this, she shot back. Now give me the phone, or I'll make sure the police know exactly what you've done. For a moment, the two women stood frozen, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. Then, with a frustrated growl, Deborah hurled the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening crack, the screen shattering on impact. Charlotte stared at the broken phone, her chest heaving with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so powerless, so completely at the mercy of someone else's actions. But even as the frustration threatened to overwhelm her, she refused to let her mother win. You think breaking my phone is going to stop me, she said, her voice trembling with determination. You can't control me anymore, Mom. And you can't stop me from getting my car back. Deborah didn't respond. She simply stood there, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable, as Charlotte turned and walked toward the Challenger. The car was still her sanctuary, her safe space, even after everything her mother had put it through. She opened the driver's side door, her hands trembling as she slid into the seat. The engine sputtered as she turned the key, but Charlotte wasn't deterred. She knew this car inside and out, and she wasn't about to let a minor issue stop her now. She adjusted the choke, tried the ignition again, and this time, the engine roared to life. Deborah took a step forward, her expression shifting from defiance to panic. Charlotte, wait. But Charlotte didn't wait. She revved the engine, the sound echoing through the building like a war cry, and threw the car into gear. As she sped out of the warehouse and onto the open road, her mother's voice faded into the distance, drowned out by the rumble of the Challenger's engine. Charlotte didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she was done letting Deborah dictate her life. This was her car, her choice, her freedom, and no one was going to take that away from her again. Charlotte sped down the deserted roads leading away from the warehouse, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The Challenger's engine roared beneath her, the familiar vibrations of the car both a comfort and a reminder of everything that had just transpired. Her mind raced even faster than the car, replaying every second of the confrontation with her mother. The sheer audacity of Deborah's actions was staggering. Not only had she stolen the car, but she had tried to sell it to some random man in a dingy warehouse. Worse still, she'd smashed Charlotte's phone in a desperate bid to prevent her from contacting the police. It was a new low, even for Deborah, and Charlotte could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest, like a physical burden. When she finally reached a safe distance, she pulled off the road into a quiet parking lot and killed the engine. The sudden silence was jarring, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the dull thud of her pulse in her ears. She leaned back in the driver's seat, staring up at the stars through the windshield, and tried to catch her breath. She knew she couldn't stay here for long. The man from the warehouse had seen her face, and for all she knew, he could have connections that would come looking for her. She had no way of knowing how deep her mother's involvement with these people went, and that uncertainty made her stomach churn. Her first priority had to be the car. It was still hers, and it was still in one piece, but it was clear that the engine wasn't running as smoothly as it should have been. Whatever that man had been tinkering with before she arrived, he hadn't finished the job. Charlotte popped the hood and climbed out, grabbing the small toolkit she kept in the trunk for emergencies. The night air was cool, and the faint hum of insects provided a stark contrast to the chaos she'd just escaped. She shone a flashlight over the engine, her practiced eyes scanning for anything out of place. It didn't take long to find the issue: a loose connection in the ignition system that was causing the misfires. The man's shoddy workmanship was almost laughable. A few twists of a wrench, and the problem was resolved. But the fact that someone had been under the hood of her car without her permission made her blood boil all over again. As she worked, Charlotte's thoughts turned to what she needed to do next. She couldn't just leave things as they were. Her mother had proven time and again that she wasn't above manipulating or outright sabotaging Charlotte's life to maintain control. And this time, Deborah had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Charlotte couldn't trust her to stay out of her business, not after everything that had happened. It wasn't just about the car anymore, it was about boundaries, respect, and the fundamental right to live her life on her own terms. But as much as Charlotte wanted to storm back to the warehouse and drag her mother out by force, she knew that wasn't an option. This situation required strategy, not raw emotion. Charlotte climbed back into the car and pulled out the spare phone she kept hidden in the glove compartment for emergencies. It was an older model, with a cracked screen and sluggish performance, but it would have to do. She dialed the non-emergency line for the local police, her hands trembling slightly as she explained the situation. She left out some of the more incriminating details about how she had tracked the car's location, focusing instead on the theft and attempted sale. The dispatcher on the other end listened patiently, promising to send an officer to meet her at a nearby station so she could file a formal report. By the time Charlotte arrived at the station, the adrenaline that had kept her going was beginning to fade, leaving her feeling drained and exhausted. The fluorescent lights inside the small, sparsely furnished building made her feel exposed, like every emotion she was trying to suppress was written plainly on her face. She took a seat in the waiting area, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and stared at the scuffed linoleum floor. It wasn't long before a young officer approached her, his expression professional but kind. He introduced himself as Officer Hughes and led her to a small interview room where she could give her statement. Charlotte recounted the events as clearly and concisely as she could, starting with the theft of the car and ending with her confrontation at the warehouse. She avoided mentioning anything that might implicate her in questionable behavior, like accessing traffic cameras or threatening the man who had been inspecting the car. Instead, she emphasized her mother's actions, providing as much detail as possible about Deborah's behavior and the man she had been dealing with. Officer Hughes took meticulous notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but he didn't interrupt her flow. By the time she finished, Charlotte felt like she had relived the entire ordeal all over again. When she was done, Hughes leaned back in his chair, his pen tapping against the edge of his notepad. "That's quite a story," he said finally. "I can see why you're upset. Theft is a serious offense, even in cases involving family members. But I have to be honest with you, cases like this can be tricky. A lot of times they get written off as domestic disputes, and it can be hard to prove criminal intent." Charlotte's heart sank. "But I have proof," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "I caught her red-handed. She tried to sell the car to a stranger. Isn't that enough?" "It's a good start," Hughes acknowledged, his tone measured. The fact that you recovered the vehicle intact works in your favor. And if we can identify the man she was dealing with, that will strengthen your case. But you should prepare yourself for the possibility that your mother will deny everything. Without a paper trail or solid evidence of her intentions, it might come down to your word against hers. Charlotte felt a wave of frustration wash over her. It wasn't fair. Deborah had stolen from her, lied to her, and tried to sabotage her life, and now she might get away with it, because the law couldn't see past the fact that they were related. But as much as she wanted to vent her anger, she forced herself to stay calm. Hughes wasn't the enemy here, and losing her temper wouldn't help her case. "What can I do to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. Hughes studied her for a moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "The best thing you can do is document everything," he said. "Keep records of any messages, voicemails, or interactions you have with your mother moving forward. If she tries to contact you, don't respond right away. Save the messages and bring them to us. And if you see or hear from the man she was dealing with, let us know immediately. The more evidence we have, the stronger your case will be." Charlotte nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to let her mother get away with this. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let Deborah's manipulative games derail her life. As she left the station, clutching a copy of the police report in her hand, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about reclaiming her car, it was about reclaiming her autonomy. The next few days were a blur of activity as Charlotte threw herself into gathering evidence. She combed through her email and text history, printing out every message her mother had sent about the car, no matter how innocuous it seemed. She reached out to a friend who worked in it, asking for help retrieving any data that might have been stored on her broken phone. And she kept her spare phone with her at all times, ready to document anything suspicious. But it wasn't just the practicalities that weighed on her. The emotional toll of the situation was impossible to ignore. Every time she thought about her mother, a mix of anger and sadness threatened to overwhelm her. Deborah's betrayal cut deeper than Charlotte had expected, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just control. There was something else driving her mother's actions, something Charlotte couldn't quite put her finger on. That suspicion was confirmed when Charlotte received an unexpected email late one night. The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the subject line sent a chill down her spine about your car. She opened the message with trembling hands and read the brief, cryptic text inside. "I know what she's been up to. Meet me at the diner on 8th Street tomorrow at noon. Come alone." Charlotte stared at the screen, her mind racing. Who was this person, and how did they know about her situation? Was it a trap? Or could this be the break she needed to finally get to the bottom of everything? She didn't know what to expect, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over yet. Charlotte couldn't shake the unease that gripped her after reading the email. The cryptic message felt like a puzzle piece she didn't yet know how to fit into the larger picture, and the mention of her mother made her stomach churn. It was one thing to deal with Deborah's manipulative tactics head-on, but the idea that someone else might be involved or even watching added a new layer of uncertainty to an already overwhelming situation. Still, Charlotte knew she couldn't ignore it. If this person had information about what her mother had been doing, she had to find out. She decided to go, but she wasn't about to throw caution to the wind. She spent the rest of the night making preparations, unable to shake the nagging feeling that she might be walking into a trap. The next morning she woke up early, her mind still racing from the restless hours she'd spent tossing and turning. She loaded her Challenger with a few tools and supplies she might need just in case, and slipped a small wrench into the inner pocket of her jacket. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel a little less vulnerable. As she drove toward the diner on 8th Street, the streets felt quieter than usual, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Charlotte's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as she approached her destination, her eyes scanning the area for anything or anyone out of place. The diner was an unassuming building, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the backdrop of the late morning sky. Charlotte parked her car a short distance away, choosing a spot where she could keep an eye on it through the window. She stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly as she crossed the threshold. The smell of fried food and stale coffee filled the air, and a handful of patrons sat scattered across the booths and counter seats. No one seemed particularly interested in her arrival, but Charlotte didn't let her guard down. She scanned the room, her gaze finally landing on a man sitting in a corner booth. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with graying hair and a weathered face that suggested a life of hard-earned experience. He caught her eye and gave a small nod, gesturing for her to join him. Charlotte approached cautiously, her heartbeat quickening with each step. As she slid into the booth across from him, he offered a tight smile, but his expression was otherwise unreadable. "Charlotte Green?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She nodded, studying him carefully. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "My name's Henry. I think I have some information you'll want to hear about your mother." Charlotte bristled at the mention of Deborah, her instincts screaming at her to remain guarded. "What do you know about her?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Henry didn't seem fazed by her tone. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table. Charlotte unfolded it carefully, her eyes widening as she took in the contents. It was a copy of a property deed, specifically the deed to Deborah's house. But what caught Charlotte's attention was the line at the bottom: a lien had been placed on the property by a private lender, and the amount owed was staggering. "Your mother's in deep," Henry said, breaking the silence. "She's been borrowing money from the wrong people, and now she's running out of ways to pay it back. That's why she tried to sell your car. She's desperate." Charlotte's stomach twisted as the weight of his words sank in. She'd suspected there was more to Deborah's actions than simple spite or control, but this revelation took things to a whole new level. "How do you know all this?" she demanded, her voice low but urgent. Henry hesitated, glancing around the diner before answering. "I used to work for the lender she's dealing with," he admitted. "But I got out when I realized how dirty the operation was. Your mother's been stringing them along for months, but they're not the kind of people who wait forever. If she doesn't pay up soon, they'll come after her, and they won't be polite about it." Charlotte's mind raced as she processed the information. It explained so much: Deborah's erratic behavior, her willingness to steal and sell to Challenger, and her constant attempts to downplay the seriousness of the situation. But it also raised new questions Charlotte wasn't sure she wanted the answers to. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "What do you get out of it?" Henry leaned back in his seat, his expression hardening. "Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see them taken down," he said cryptically. "But if you want to protect yourself and your car, you're going to need to act fast. They're already watching her, and it won't be long before they figure out she doesn't have the means to pay. When that happens, they'll come looking for anything of value, including you." The warning sent a chill down Charlotte's spine. She didn't want to believe that things could escalate further, but deep down, she knew Henry was right. Deborah's debts had already dragged Charlotte into a mess she never asked for, and if these people were as dangerous as Henry suggested, the worst was yet to come. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Henry slid another piece of paper across the table, a list of names and addresses, along with a series of cryptic notes. "These are the people you need to avoid," he said firmly. "They're the ones handling your mother's account, and they won't think twice about using intimidation to get what they want. If they show up at your door, don't engage. Just call the police and stay out of their way." Charlotte scanned the list, her pulse quickening as she committed the names to memory. She didn't like the idea of being dragged into Deborah's mess any further, but she knew she couldn't afford to ignore the threat. "What about my mother?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. "What happens to her?" Henry shrugged, his expression neutral. "That's up to her. She made this bed and now she has to lie in it. But if I were you, I'd keep my distance. She's not going to change, and you don't want to get caught in the crossfire." Charlotte's chest tightened as his words hit home. As much as she hated to admit it, Henry was right. Deborah had made her choices, and it wasn't Charlotte's responsibility to clean up her mess. But walking away wasn't that simple. Deborah was still her mother, and no matter how strained their relationship had become, a part of Charlotte still felt obligated to try and help. "Thanks for the warning," she said finally, rising from her seat. but I need to figure this out on my own." Henry gave her a knowing look but didn't argue. "Just be careful," he said simply, "and remember some people can't be saved." Charlotte left the diner with a heavy heart, the weight of Henry's words pressing down on her like a lead blanket. As she climbed back into her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into a void she couldn't yet see the bottom of. Deborah's actions had put them both in danger, and now it was up to Charlotte to navigate a path through the chaos without losing herself in the process. She started the engine and drove off, the road stretching out before her like a question she didn't yet have the answer to. Charlotte gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove back toward her garage, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the empty streets. Henry's words echoed in her mind, each syllable a reminder of just how far things had spiraled out of control. Her mother had entangled herself with dangerous people, and now, by extension, those same people had their sights set on her. The Challenger, once her sanctuary, had become a beacon of risk, drawing attention she never asked for. It wasn't just about protecting the car anymore, it was about keeping herself safe from the fallout of her mother's recklessness. By the time Charlotte pulled into her driveway, the weight of the situation had settled heavily on her shoulders. Her garage, normally a place of solace, felt more like a prison now, a place where she could hide but not escape the looming threats. She parked the Challenger inside and locked the door behind her, double-checking the deadbolt as a knot tightened in her stomach. Every sound outside, every car passing by, every faint echo of footsteps on the sidewalk made her jump. She was on edge, her nerves frayed by the constant sense of impending danger. Charlotte knew she needed a plan. She couldn't simply sit and wait for something to happen, not when the stakes were this high. Henry's warning about the people tracking her mother had been clear. They wouldn't stop at intimidation if they thought they could get what they wanted. Charlotte had to figure out how to get ahead of them, how to protect herself and the car from becoming collateral damage in her mother's increasingly dire situation. She spent the next several hours preparing, her movements precise and deliberate as she worked to secure her garage. She reinforced the locks on the doors and windows, installed an extra layer of security on the garage door, and set up a series of cameras to monitor the perimeter. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing, and the act of doing something, even something small, helped to steady her frayed nerves. Once the physical barriers were in place, Charlotte turned her attention to the car itself. She'd already fixed the engine issues caused by the man at the warehouse, but now she went a step further, installing a kill switch that would prevent the car from being started without her knowledge. If anyone tried to take it again, they wouldn't get far. As the hours ticked by, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the city outside her garage was bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. Charlotte sat at her workbench, her tools neatly arranged in front of her, and tried to think through her next move. She couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next crisis to land at her feet. She needed to confront Deborah, to put an end to whatever mess her mother had created before it spiraled even further out of control. But confronting Deborah meant more than just a heated argument. It meant forcing her mother to face the consequences of her actions, something Deborah had spent a lifetime avoiding. Charlotte knew it wouldn't be easy. Deborah was a master manipulator, someone who could twist any situation to suit her narrative, but Charlotte was done playing by her mother's rules. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Officer Hughes. If anyone could help her navigate the legal minefield ahead, it was him. She hesitated for a moment before pressing the call button, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Hughes answered on the second ring, his voice calm and professional. Officer Hughes speaking. "It's Charlotte," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I need your help." Hughes listened patiently as Charlotte explained the situation, filling in the gaps she hadn't mentioned during their previous conversation. She told him about Henry, about the lien on Deborah's house, and about the dangerous people her mother had gotten involved with. She didn't hold back, laying everything out in stark detail. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Charlotte could hear the faint sound of Hughes scribbling notes. "This is serious, Charlotte," he said finally, his tone grave. "If what you're saying is true, your mother is in deeper trouble than we realized. And if these people are as dangerous as you say, you need to be extremely careful. They won't hesitate to come after you if they think you're a threat to their operation. I know, Charlotte said quietly. That's why I'm calling you. I can't handle this on my own. I need to stop her before she drags me or anyone else even further into this mess. Hughes let out a heavy sigh. All right, he said. Here's what we're going to do. I'll file an official report with the department and see if we can start building a case against the people she's dealing with. In the meantime, I need you to document everything, every interaction, every message. Every detail you can remember. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case will be. And Charlotte. Yes. Don't confront her alone. If you're going to talk to her, let me know first. I'll make sure someone's there to back you up. Charlotte nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Thank you, she said softly. I appreciate it. After hanging up, Charlotte felt a small flicker of relief, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this anymore, and for the first time in days she felt like she had a plan. But relief was short-lived. Less than an hour later, her phone buzzed with a new message. She picked it up, her heart sinking as she read the words on the screen. You shouldn't have involved the cops. This isn't going to end well for you. The message was unsigned, but Charlotte didn't need to guess who it was from. The people her mother was involved with had clearly caught wind of her actions, and now they were sending a clear warning. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, her mind racing with possibilities. They knew she'd gone to the police, which meant they were likely watching her. The cameras she'd installed outside suddenly felt inadequate, like flimsy shields against an encroaching storm. Charlotte didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in the Challenger, her wrench still tucked into her jacket pocket, and kept watch over the garage. Every shadow, every creak of the building settling, made her pulse race. She hated the feeling of being trapped, of waiting for something to happen, but she knew better than to let her guard down. The night passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity, until the first rays of dawn broke through the darkness. The next day, she met with Hughes at the station, handing over the message she'd received and the list of names Henry had given her. Hughes's expression darkened as he read the text, and he immediately called for backup. We're not taking any chances, he said firmly. If they're threatening you, they've already crossed a line. We'll keep an eye on your property and make sure you're protected. Charlotte nodded, grateful for his support, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse before they got better. And she was right. Later that afternoon, as she was checking the cameras outside her garage, she noticed a black SUV idling across the street. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, but the longer she watched, the more certain she became that the car wasn't there by coincidence. She stepped outside, her heart pounding in her chest, and approached the SUV cautiously. As she drew closer, the driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man with a cold, calculating expression. Nice car, he said, his voice dripping with thinly veiled menace. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. Charlotte didn't flinch, didn't let him see the fear bubbling beneath the surface. What do you want, she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just a friendly warning, he said. Stay out of your mother's business. It's better for everyone that way. Charlotte stood her ground, her gaze locked on his. Tell that to her, she shot back. She's the one dragging me into this. The man's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Suit yourself, he said curtly, rolling up the window. This SUV pulled away, leaving Charlotte standing in the street, her heart racing and her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about her mother's debts anymore. It was about standing up to the people who thought they could control her life. As she watched the SUV disappear around the corner, Charlotte made a promise to herself no matter what it took, she was going to fight back. Charlotte stood in the garage, staring at the Challenger as though it might somehow offer her an answer to the chaos that had consumed her life over the past few days. The encounter with the man in the SUV had cemented a truth she had been trying to avoid. This wasn't just about her mother's debts anymore. These people saw her as a problem, as someone who could get in the way of their business, and they had made it clear they were willing to escalate things if she didn't back down. But Charlotte had never been the type to run. She had spent her entire life fighting against the constraints her mother had tried to place on her, pushing back against every attempt to control her future. This was no different. She wasn't going to let these people intimidate her into silence, and she sure as hell wasn't going to let her mother drag her down with her. She checked her phone, scanning through the messages she had exchanged with Officer Hughes over the past 24 hours. He had assigned an unmarked patrol car to keep an eye on her house, but even that didn't make her feel entirely safe. The threats had been vague, but she knew better than to underestimate people who operated outside the law. If they wanted to make a point, they wouldn't hesitate. That thought alone kept her on edge, her nerves frayed as she tried to anticipate their next move. But she didn't have time to sit around waiting. If she was going to take control of the situation, she needed to act now. Charlotte grabbed her jacket and keys, her mind already made up. She had one last confrontation left before she could put this entire nightmare behind her. As much as she hated the thought of seeing her mother again, she knew there was no avoiding it. Deborah had started this mess, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. Charlotte drove with purpose, weaving through the streets with the kind of controlled precision that came naturally to her behind the wheel. Every mile that passed only strengthened her resolve. She wasn't coming to beg, to reason, or to clean up after her mother's mistakes. She was coming to end this once and for all. By the time she pulled up in front of Deborah's house, the sky had darkened, a storm brewing on the horizon. It felt fitting, as though the universe itself recognized the weight of the confrontation that was about to unfold. Charlotte killed the engine and stepped out, her boots crunching against the gravel driveway as she approached the front door. She didn't hesitate before knocking, the force of it loud enough to echo through the quiet street. It took nearly a full minute before the door opened, and when it did, Deborah stood on the other side looking both surprised and annoyed. "Charlotte," she said, her tone laced with exasperation, "what are you doing here?" Charlotte pushed past her, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. Deborah let out an irritated sigh but didn't protest, closing the door behind her. The house was dimly lit, the air thick with the stale scent of cigarette smoke and cheap wine. It looked the same as it always had, messy, cluttered, a reflection of the chaos Deborah seemed to thrive in. Charlotte turned to face her mother, arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. "I know everything," she said bluntly. "The debts, the people you owe, the fact that you tried to sell my car to cover your own mistakes." Deborah's expression flickered, a brief moment of unease crossing her face before she schooled her features into something more neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said smoothly, but Charlotte wasn't interested in playing games. "Cut the crap, Mom," she snapped. "I met Henry. He told me everything. You're in deep, and these people aren't just going to let you walk away from this." For the first time, Deborah looked genuinely rattled. She shifted her weight, crossing her arms as though trying to make herself smaller. "Henry needs to keep his mouth shut," she muttered. "This isn't your problem, Charlotte. You should just stay out of it." Charlotte let out a bitter laugh. "Stay out of it," she repeated. "You dragged me into this the second you stole my car and tried to sell it. You made it my problem when you put me on these people's radar, and now they think I'm some kind of loose end that needs tying up. So no, I'm not staying out of it." Deborah's jaw tightened, her gaze darting to the window as though expecting someone to be watching. "You don't understand how these things work," she said finally. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Charlotte shot back. "And you made the wrong one." Over and over again. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Charlotte could see the cracks in her mother's carefully constructed armor, the desperation lurking just beneath the surface. For the first time in her life, she saw Deborah not as an unstoppable force, but as something smaller, weaker. Someone who had spent so much time trying to control others that she had lost control of her own life. "I can't fix this for you," Charlotte said quietly, "but I can walk away, and I think that's exactly what I need to do." Deborah's head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. "Charlotte, wait." But Charlotte was already turning toward the door. "No," she interrupted. "I've spent my whole life letting you drag me down with you. I'm done." She didn't wait for a response. She stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her like a shock to the system. She could hear Deborah calling after her, But she didn't turn back. Not this time. She climbed into the Challenger, the engine rumbling to life beneath her hands, and for the first time in days she felt something close to relief. She didn't need her mother's approval. She didn't need to clean up her messes. She had done everything she could, and now it was time to let go. As she pulled away from the house, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't just leaving her mother behind, she was leaving behind years of manipulation, of guilt, of being made to feel like she wasn't enough. The road stretched out ahead of her, endless and open, and for the first time in her life she felt like she was finally free.